The document hit the desk like a thunderclap, and every man in the Crockett County land office went dead silent. Jonas Wallace had ridden hard through 2 days of blistering Texas heat to get here, carrying the territorial governor's letter in his breast pocket like a loaded weapon. He was the law in 3 counties, a deputy marshal with a reputation that made outlaws reconsider their life choices when they heard his name. He had never once failed to execute an order. Not once in 7 years of wearing the star. But the woman standing across the desk from him, her dark eyes cool as river water and absolutely unmoved by his authority, was sliding a paper toward him that made every confident assumption he had ridden in with collapse like a rotted fence post. "You'll want to read that carefully, Deputy," Fannie Baker said, her voice even and precise, the voice of a woman who had already won and was simply waiting for the other party to figure it out. "The Desert Land Act filing, the plat map I completed with full meets and bounds, and the registration stamp from the county recorder in Austin, filed 43 days ago. You can check the date if you like. The ink is thoroughly dry." Jonas picked up the document. His jaw was tight. The muscles in his forearms, thick from years of roping and riding, went rigid as he turned the pages. He was reading it the way a man reads a sentence he is certain must contain an error, scanning it again and again, searching for the flaw that would let him disbelieve what was plainly in front of him. There was no flaw. Fannie watched him read. She had known this moment was coming for weeks, had prepared for it with the same methodical precision she brought to every survey, every calculated measurement, every line she drew across the unyielding Texas earth. She had known that someone would ride in with authority and an order and the expectation that a woman alone on a disputed quarter section would be easily displaced. She had simply made sure that when that moment arrived, the law would already be standing on her side of the line. Jonas set the paper down. He looked up at her. For the first time in a very long while, Deputy Jonas Wallace did not know what to say. The land office clerk, a thin man named Hargrove who had worked this county for 11 years, leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "She's right, Deputy Wallace. I checked it myself when she rode down from the survey 3 weeks back. Everything is filed properly. The federal claim is valid." Jonas stared at the paper. Then he looked at Fannie Baker again, and something shifted behind his eyes, something complicated and not entirely professional. She was not what he had expected. He was not what she had expected either, though she would not have admitted that to anyone. It had started 6 months earlier, in the spring of 1882, when the Pecos River basin was still green from a rare wet winter, and the land itself seemed to be offering an invitation to everyone who could move fast enough to accept it. Fannie Baker had come to West Texas from St. Louis, though calling her background simply St. Louis, the way you might call a river simply water, was a profound understatement. She had been trained by her father, Edmund Baker, one of the most respected civil engineers in the Mississippi Valley, a man who had surveyed the routes for 3 railroad expansions and had the good sense to recognize, when his eldest daughter showed the same spatial intelligence he possessed, that he ought to teach her everything he knew rather than watch the talent go to waste. Edmund Baker was not a radical man. He was simply practical. Fannie could read a transit level by the time she was 14. She could calculate latitude by celestial observation before she was 17. She understood the mathematics of land measurement, the subtleties of the Desert Land Act of 1877, the Homestead Act, the legal distinctions between a preemption claim and a proper desert land filing with the same fluency that other young women of her era understood social calls and embroidery. She understood those things too, if she was being honest. She just found them considerably less interesting. When Edmund Baker died of a fever in the winter of 1880, he left Fannie his surveying equipment, his extensive library of legal codes and land regulations, a small amount of cash, and a letter that told her she was the most capable person he had ever known, and that she should go prove it somewhere the world was still being made rather than merely maintained. She had grieved him deeply, quietly, in the way of people who hold their feelings in a strong interior grip. Then she had packed his theodolite, his chains, his level rods, and his books into a trunk and bought a ticket west. Texas in 1882 was, in the most literal sense, a land of contested boundaries. The end of the open range era was crashing against the beginning of the fenced and filed era, with the force of geological plates colliding. The railroad had pushed into previously inaccessible country. Speculators were filing claims on land they had never seen. Cattle barons were using old Mexican land grant ambiguities to assert holdings that had never been properly surveyed. And the federal government was trying to impose order on all of it with a legal framework that was sophisticated on paper and chaotic in practice. Fannie had arrived in the town of Red Rock, Texas, in March of 1882 with a clear head, a complete set of instruments, and a specific piece of information that she had obtained through meticulous research in the Federal Land Records Office in Austin before she ever left the city. A quarter section of land in the Pecos River Basin, 160 acres of ground that straddled a seasonal creek and included a spring-fed meadow, had never been properly adjudicated despite being claimed by 3 separate parties over the preceding decade. The Harlan family, a cattle operation out of Midland, claimed it under an old Mexican grant that their patriarch insisted predated Texas statehood. A speculator named Dupree had filed a homestead claim in 1878 that had lapsed when he failed to make the required improvements, and the Territorial Land Commission under Governor Roberts had designated a portion of it as public grazing land, a designation that was itself legally questionable given the Desert Land Act provisions that had been passed by Congress the previous year. Fannie had read all 3 claims. She had read the Desert Land Act itself, the enabling statutes, the case precedents from Nevada and California where similar disputes had already been adjudicated, and the specific county records for Crockett County going back to the Republic of Texas era. She had done all of this before she ever packed a single surveying chain. Her conclusion was precise and documented. None of the 3 existing claims held legal priority under the current federal statute. The land was legally available under the Desert Land Act to any qualifying entrant who could prove irrigation development and file a proper plat survey within the required period, and she was qualified to both perform the survey and make the filing. She rode out to the quarter section in late March with a hired hand named Pete Ochoa, a 60-year-old Mexican vaquero who knew the country like the back of his weathered hand, and spent 3 weeks running the survey with a thoroughness that would have satisfied the most demanding federal examiner. The country was beautiful in a way that struck something deep in her. Not the soft, comfortable beauty of the Missouri countryside she had grown up in, but something harder and stranger, an immense, indifferent grandeur that did not care whether you admired it or feared it. The limestone breaks along the creek, the prickly pear spreading across the slopes in muted green, the way the sky at dusk turned colors she did not have adequate names for. These things got into her in ways she had not anticipated. She set her stakes, ran her chains, took her celestial observations to establish latitude and longitude with scientific precision, drew her plat map with the careful hand of someone who had been taught that a line in the wrong place was a form of lie. She calculated the acreage of the spring-fed meadow and the seasonal creek drainage. She noted the presence of the underground water that the Desert Land Act required a claimant to demonstrate they could develop for irrigation. Then she rode to Austin and filed everything. The county recorder, a man named Whitfield who had seen every variety of land scheme Texas had to offer, had looked at her filing with unconcealed surprise, then with growing respect as he checked her figures, and found them not only accurate but exemplary. He stamped the documents and recorded them in the federal plat book, and Fannie Baker became the legal claimant to 160 acres of Crockett County, Texas. What she did not know, when she filed those documents, was that the Harlan family had connections. Specifically, they had a connection to the territorial governor's office through a political arrangement that was not exactly corrupt, but was not exactly clean either. And when the Harlans heard that a woman alone had filed a valid desert land claim on the ground they had been using for cattle grazing for 15 years, they were furious enough to contact the governor's office directly. The governor, who owed the Harlan family a favor of the kind that gets quietly repaid without official documentation, had sent a letter to the deputy marshal's office requesting that someone ride to Crockett County to investigate the land filing. He had been careful with his language. Investigate, not invalidate. He was a politician, not a fool. Jonas Wallace had drawn the assignment because he was the deputy with the most experience in land dispute resolution, and because his supervisor, Marshal Court Haverford, believed that Jonas had the judgment to handle something complicated without making it worse. Jonas had accepted the assignment without particular enthusiasm. Land disputes in 1882 Texas were a legal and political labyrinth, and he had enough of those already. He had not been told that the claimant was a woman. He had not been told anything about Fannie Baker at all, just that a recent desert land filing on the Harlan disputed parcel was being reviewed at the governor's request, and that his job was to attend the land office in Redrock and examine the filing. So he had ridden in expecting a squatter or a speculator, expecting someone who had taken advantage of a technicality and could be quietly encouraged to step aside with a combination of legal persuasion and the implied weight of official authority. He had not ridden in expecting Fannie Baker. And now he was standing in the Redrock land office with the most thoroughly documented and legally airtight land claim he had ever seen spread across the desk in front of him. And the woman who had filed it was watching him with those steady dark eyes, and he was going through an experience that was, for a man like Jonas Wallace, essentially unprecedented. He was being outlawed by a woman in her middle 20s, and instead of being angry about it, which was what he had expected to feel, he was deeply, profoundly impressed. "How long have you been in the survey business?" he asked, and he was aware that it was not the right professional question, but it was the honest one. "My father trained me," Fannie said. "I have been working independently for 2 years. Why?" "Because this plat map," Jonas said, and he picked it up carefully, holding it the way you hold something you have begun to understand is precious, "is the most precisely drafted survey I have seen in 3 years of reviewing land filings, and I have reviewed a very great many." Hargrove, the clerk, made a small sound of agreement. Fannie felt something warm move through her chest at those words, something she was not expecting and did not entirely welcome, because she had a great deal of discipline, and she needed all of it for what was coming next. She kept her expression neutral. "That is the standard my father held me to," she said. "I do not see the value of doing it any other way." "The Harlan family is going to contest this," Jonas said. He was not threatening her. He was telling her the truth, and the even, factual way he said it told her something about him that she filed away carefully. "They have resources and they have political connections and they are not accustomed to losing." "I know," Fannie said. "I expected that." "Which is why the filing is complete, legally defensible, and already registered in Austin. The burden of proof now rests with any party contesting the claim. Under the Desert Land Act, a valid filed claim with demonstrated survey and water development evidence takes legal precedence over an unregistered historical usage. The Harlans may contest it in federal court if they choose. I welcome that examination." Jonas stared at her for a long moment. He had the look of a man reassembling his assumptions from the ground up. "You researched the case law," he said. "Thoroughly," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, but it was entirely genuine. "Miss Baker," he said, "I have to report to the governor's office that I examined the filing and found it legally valid." "Which is exactly what I am going to do." He paused. "I would suggest you not be alone out there when the Harlans find out. It was the first crack in the professional distance between them, small and probably unintentional, but Fannie felt it. "I appreciate the concern," she said carefully, "but I am not accustomed to requiring assistance." "No," Jonas said, and now there was something in his voice that was quietly different from authority or professional courtesy. There was something that recognized her, the way you recognize a rare thing when you see it. "I don't imagine you are." He gathered his copy of the report, tipped his hat with a formality that was nonetheless respectful, and walked out of the land office into the midday Texas sun. He mounted his horse and rode to the telegraph office. He sent a brief, accurate report to the governor's office, stating that the desert land filing in question was legally complete and valid, and that he found no grounds for federal intervention. Then he sat in the telegraph office for a long moment, staring at the dusty street, thinking about the precise lines of that plat map and the woman who had drawn them. He had a sudden, irrational, and completely unprofessional urge to turn his horse back toward the quarter section rather than toward his next assignment. He resisted it. He was a man who had spent 7 years building discipline out of necessity, and discipline was one of the things he was best at. He rode toward Midland instead, because there was another matter there that required his attention. And he spent 3 days in Midland trying not to think about Fannie Baker, and the way she had stood in that land office like she owned not just the ground she had filed on, but the entire concept of being right. He was not successful. Fannie, for her part, returned to the quarter section and continued the work she had begun. The Desert Land Act required ongoing demonstration of water development, and she had plans for a diversion channel from the spring to a holding pond that would establish the irrigation use the law demanded. Pete Ochoa had brought his nephew, a young man named Rodrigo, to help with the heavier earthwork, and the 3 of them worked in the rising spring heat with a methodical efficiency that was satisfying in the way that honest physical labor is satisfying. She thought about the deputy more than she wanted to. Jonas Wallace was not what she had expected from a man wearing a star and carrying a governor's letter. She had expected bullying or condescension, or the particular combination of both that men in authority often deployed when facing a woman who had stepped outside the expected boundaries. She had prepared herself for it, had her legal arguments assembled like ammunition. Instead, she had found a man who read the documents carefully and admitted what they contained, who told her the truth about the threat she faced rather than pretending it did not exist, and who had looked at her plat map with an expression of genuine professional respect that she had only ever seen on her father's face. She drove a stake into the ground with more force than was strictly necessary and told herself she was being foolish. The Harlan trouble came on a Thursday in late April, which was exactly when she had calculated it would arrive, roughly 3 weeks after the governor's office received Jonas's report. 2 of the Harlan ranch hands rode onto the claim, men named Ruger and Dell, who had the practiced menace of people who performed this kind of intimidation professionally. They told Fannie that the Harlan family considered the filing invalid, that her survey was disputed, and that she would be wise to take her equipment and leave before the situation became unpleasant. Fannie was standing on the edge of the diversion channel project when they delivered this message. She was wearing work clothes, heavy canvas trousers, and a linen shirt, her dark hair braided back from her face, and she had a survey rod in one hand and the full knowledge that she was holding every legal card in the deck. "The filing is registered in Austin," she said, with the same level calm she had used in the land office. "Any interference with a valid desert land claimant is a federal offense. You may tell Mr. Harlan that if his men set foot on this property again without my invitation, I will file a federal complaint for interference with a land claim, and the deputy marshal will be obliged to respond to that." Ruger, the larger of the 2, looked at her with a contempt that was partly genuine and partly a performance for his companion. "We'll be back," he said. "I'll be here," Fannie said. They rode off. Pete Ochoa, who had watched the exchange from 20 yards away with his hand resting on the revolver he carried at his hip, let out a slow breath when they cleared the property line. "Miss Baker," he said, "those men will not be the last." "No," she agreed, "they will not." She sat down that evening and wrote a careful letter to the Federal Land Office in Austin, documenting the attempted intimidation and formally requesting that the filing be noted as contested so that any subsequent interference would have an official record preceding it. Then she wrote a second letter to the Deputy Marshal's office in Pecos, which was the nearest office she had a contact at, describing the incident and formally requesting that the matter be noted. She did not write the letter expecting Jonas Wallace to be the one who received it. She wrote it because it was the correct legal procedure and because she understood that building a documented record was how you protected a claim against powerful opposition. Jonas was in Pecos when her letter arrived. He read it twice. He sat with it for a long moment, and then he went to his supervisor's office and told Marshal Haverford that the Crockett County land matter required a follow-up visit, that there had been reported harassment of a valid federal claimant, and that he was the deputy with the relevant background on the case, and therefore the appropriate person to respond. Haverford, who was a perceptive man with 25 years of experience, looked at his deputy with a slight narrowing of his eyes. He had seen Jonas Wallace take on everything from train robberies to cattle theft without requiring a second look. He noted that the deputy was requesting follow-up on a paperwork matter with an enthusiasm he usually reserved for significantly more dangerous assignments. He said yes, because the request was professionally justified, and because he was also a man who believed that sometimes the things that surprised you were worth paying attention to. Jonas rode to Raydrock and then out to the quarter section, arriving on a bright May morning when the creek willows were fresh with new leaves and the air smelled of water and warming limestone. He found Fannie at the diversion channel, knee-deep in clear spring water, directing Rodrigo with the precise placement of a stone weir that would control the flow into the holding pond she was constructing. She was entirely absorbed in the work, making small adjustments to the placement with the focused attention of someone for whom the measurements mattered at a level others could not quite follow. She looked up when she heard his horse and went still for a moment. Then she climbed out of the water, picked up the canvas cloth she had left on the bank, and dried her hands with a composure that Jonas, watching from the saddle, found completely remarkable. "Deputy Wallace," she said. "Miss Baker," he said, swinging down. He tied the horse to a willow branch and walked toward her with the letter in his hand, though he was more interested in the weir construction than was strictly relevant to his professional purpose. "I received your report about the Harlan men, and it's on the official record now. Any subsequent interference is grounds for a federal charge." He paused, looking at the channel. "Is that a controlled diversion weir?" "Yes," she said. "The spring output is approximately 400 gallons per hour under current conditions. I am routing 60% of that into the holding pond, which will have a capacity of approximately 12,000 gallons when complete. The remainder continues down the natural channel to the main creek. It satisfies the Desert Land Act's water development requirement for the acreage on file." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the weir the way he had looked at the plat map, with a slow, assembling attention that took things apart and put them back together. "You calculated the spring output," he said. "I measured it over 3 days using a calibrated bucket and a pocket watch," she said. "The variation between morning and afternoon was less than 4%, which indicates a fairly stable underground source rather than surface collection. That matters for the long-term viability of the claim." He looked at her. There it was again, that expression she had noticed in the land office, the one that was not quite professional respect because it had something warmer moving underneath it. "Your father trained you well," he said, and the way he said it was not the polished compliment of a man being socially appropriate. It was the flat, honest assessment of a man who meant exactly what he said. "He did," she said, and her voice was quieter than she intended. She cleared her throat. "You rode a long way to tell me something I already knew about the official record." "I rode a long way," he agreed, "to make sure you were not alone out here with the Harlans making threats." She regarded him with a directness that made most men look away. Jonas Wallace did not look away. "I am capable of managing my own situation," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I came anyway." It was the simplest thing he could have said, and it was precisely the right thing, because it did not question her capability, but it also did not pretend that care was irrelevant. Fannie felt that warmth move through her chest again, more persistently this time, and she decided that ignoring it was not a strategy that was going to work indefinitely. "There is coffee on the camp stove," she said, which was as close as she could reasonably come to saying she was glad he had. They sat by the fire that evening, Pete and Rodrigo having retired to their bedrolls on the far side of the camp, and talked for 2 hours in the cooling desert night. Jonas told her about the 7 years he had spent as a deputy marshal, about growing up in Kansas on a small farm before the war that had consumed his family's stability, about learning to read law from a justice of the peace in Dodge City who had taken a chance on a young man with too much anger and not enough direction. He was not a man who talked about himself easily, and the fact that he was doing it told her something. Fannie told him about Edmund Baker and the survey education that had been her father's most particular gift, about the calculation she had made when he died that she could either mourn what she had lost or use what she had been given, about the months in Austin going through land records before she ever came to Crockett County. She told him about the specific moment, sitting in a back room of the Federal Records Office with a lamp burning down, and case law stacked to her elbow, when she had seen with the clarity of a surveyor's level precisely what the legal landscape looked like, and what move was available to someone with her specific knowledge and willingness to make it. "That was the moment you decided," Jonas said. "That was the moment I knew," she said. "The decision was made a long time before that, when my father gave me my first surveying chain and told me that a properly drawn line was one of the most powerful things a person could put on paper because it defined what belonged to whom and where the law stood." Jonas looked at the fire for a long moment. "He was right," he said. "He was almost always right," she said, and the grief in her voice was old and settled, not raw, but it was real and he heard it. "I'm sorry you lost him," Jonas said, and he meant it with a sincerity that was uncomplicated and direct, the way he meant most things. She looked at him across the fire, this rugged, quiet man with his broad shoulders and his worn lawman star, and his habit of saying exactly what he meant without any performance around it. She had spent 2 years being thoroughly self-sufficient, and had believed, in the way that people who are good at solitude sometimes do, that she had no particular need for anything beyond the work and the quiet and the enormous Texas sky. She was beginning to suspect that this belief had been a convenience rather than a truth. The trouble came in earnest in early June, and it came in a form she had not quite anticipated. Cal Harlan, the patriarch of the family, was 64 years old and had been running cattle in Crockett County for 20 years. He was not a brutal man in the direct physical sense, though the men who worked for him could be. He was the kind of man who preferred to solve problems through legal and political pressure, and when those failed, he was willing to apply a more direct version of pressure while maintaining a respectful distance from it personally. He hired a lawyer named Breckenridge out of San Antonio, a man with a reputation for creative legal interpretation, and Breckenridge filed a contest with the Federal Land Office in Austin claiming that Fannie Baker's desert land filing was defective on technical grounds. Specifically, he argued that the survey's reference baseline was improperly established relative to the Federal Rectangular Survey System's principal meridian for the region, and that therefore the metes and bounds description in the filing was legally insufficient to establish a valid claim. It was a sophisticated argument. It was also, in Fannie's precise technical opinion, completely wrong, and she knew exactly why and exactly how to prove it. The argument rested on a misreading of the surveying methodology required for irregular terrain under the General Land Office's instructions to surveyors, a document that Fannie had read in its entirety multiple times and could practically recite. In rough country with significant elevation change, the surveyor was explicitly permitted under the regulations to use local astronomical observation to establish the reference meridian, rather than chaining from the nearest permanent corner monument, when that corner was more than 4 miles distant. The nearest permanent corner from her parcel was 5¾ miles away, clearly beyond the threshold. She wrote her rebuttal herself, in the careful, precise language of someone who understood both the law and the technical surveying standards it referenced, and she sent it to the Federal Land Office with complete documentation of her celestial observation data, her chain measurements, and the General Land Office instructions that governed the methodology she had used. She also sent a copy to Jonas, because by June they had established a correspondence that was professionally justified and personally meaningful to both of them. Jonas read her rebuttal with the same assembling attention he gave everything she produced. He was not a surveyor. He understood land law at the level required for his work, which was functional rather than expert. But he understood precision, and he understood the difference between an argument that was built on solid ground and one that was built on strategic ambiguity. And Fannie Baker's rebuttal was the former in a way that made Breckenridge's challenge look, in comparison, like a house of cards in a windstorm. He also, in the quiet of his office in Pecos on a June evening, wrote her a personal letter that was the most honest thing he had written since he could remember. He told her that he had been thinking about the quarter section and the spring-fed meadow and the conversation by the fire since May. He told her that he had begun to understand that the reason he had requested to return to Crockett County was not entirely professional. He told her that he had no expectation of anything, that he understood her independence and respected it, but that he would be a dishonest man if he pretended that he had not been thinking about her in a way that had nothing to do with land filings. He sealed the letter and stared at it for a long time. Then he sent it, because he was a man who had spent 7 years doing difficult things and had learned that the anticipation of difficulty was almost always worse than the difficulty itself. Fannie received his letter on a Tuesday and read it standing in the morning sun outside her tent at the camp on the quarter section. She read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat and went to work on the holding pond measurements, and she spent the entire day being precise and methodical and not thinking about it, which is to say, she spent the entire day thinking about it. That evening she wrote back. She was not a woman who was coy about things she understood clearly, and she understood what she felt with the same clarity she brought to a survey calculation. She told him that she had also been thinking about the conversation by the fire, and about the way he had read her plat map, and about the specific quality of his honesty, which she had found in her experience to be the rarest thing in a person. She told him that she did not have a great deal of practice with this kind of correspondence, and that she suspected he did not either, but that she thought they were both old enough to say honest things without excessive decorating of the truth. She told him that she was glad he had written back in May. His answering letter took 6 days to arrive and was considerably longer than the first one. By July, the Federal Land Office had reviewed her rebuttal to Breckenridge's challenge and rejected the challenge on the merits. The office's examiner wrote a brief but clear decision stating that Baker's survey methodology was in compliance with General Land Office instructions for irregular terrain, and that the reference meridian establishment via astronomical observation was properly documented and legally sufficient. The challenge was dismissed. Breckenridge filed a second challenge, this time arguing that the water development work was insufficient to meet the Desert Land Act's irrigation requirements for the full 160 acres. This challenge had more potential merit, because the holding pond was not yet complete, and the acreage that could be practically irrigated from the spring was somewhat less than the full quarter section. Fannie had anticipated this. She had spent considerable time on the legal question of what demonstrated water development actually required under the Act, and had concluded, based on her research, that showing active construction of irrigation infrastructure combined with documented water rights establishment satisfied the requirement even if the full system was not yet operational. She also knew that the Act's 5-year proving-up period meant she had time to complete the development. But the challenge created a formal hearing requirement, which meant she was going to have to appear before a federal land examiner in San Antonio and make her case in person. Jonas was in San Antonio in late July on an unrelated matter when she arrived, and the coincidence, if it was a coincidence, which she suspected it was not entirely, meant that they saw each other face to face for the first time since May. She arrived at the hotel where the hearing was to be held, dusty and tired from 3 days of hard travel, and found him in the lobby. He stood up when she came through the door, and she saw something move across his face that she thought, with a precision she applied to the important things, was relief. He crossed the room toward her without hesitation and took her hand. Not the careful, socially regulated handshake of a professional meeting, but something warmer, something that acknowledged everything the letters had said. His hands were large and rough and warm, and she held on for a moment longer than was necessary. "How was the road?" he said. "Dusty," she said, "but I am here." "You are," he said, and he was looking at her with an openness that she had not expected from a man whose public manner was contained and authoritative. He looked at her like she was someone he had been waiting to see. The hearing was the following morning. Breckenridge was there with his polished San Antonio manner and his careful legal language, and the federal examiner was a man named Crowley who had the professionally neutral expression of a career bureaucrat. Fannie presented her case herself. She had prepared a complete documentation package including the irrigation construction progress, the water rights filing she had made with the county, the spring output measurements, and a detailed timeline of the water development project with projected completion dates. She had also prepared a legal brief, written in her own hand, arguing the statutory interpretation of the Desert Land Act's development requirements based on the legislative history of the Act and the analogous case law from Nevada and California. She presented all of it with the clarity and precision of someone who had lived inside the relevant legal and technical material for months. Crowley, to his credit, listened with careful attention. He asked 4 specific technical questions, all of which she answered without hesitation. He asked Breckenridge 2 questions, both of which required the lawyer to consult his notes. Jonas sat in the back of the hearing room and watched. He had no official role here. He was not a party to the proceedings. He was a federal deputy marshal who happened to be in San Antonio, and if the presence of a federal officer in the back of the room had some slight effect on the atmosphere of the proceedings, that was not precisely his concern. What he was doing, in the plainest terms, was witnessing something that he had only partially understood from the letters and from the documents and from the brief conversations at the quarter section. Fannie Baker arguing her own case before a federal examiner was a different and more complete version of the thing he had been assembling in his mind for 4 months. She was not performing confidence. She was not strategic or calculated in the way of someone deploying a presentation. She was simply herself, in full, bringing everything she knew to bear with a completeness and an integrity that made the room feel, somehow, smaller than her. He had been in love with her for at least 2 months. He was fairly certain of that. But in that hearing room in San Antonio, watching her dismantle a lawyer's technical argument with the precision of a surgeon and the quiet authority of someone who had simply done the work better than anyone else, the feeling crystallized into something so clear and settled that he understood it was permanent. Crowley ruled in her favor the following afternoon. The second challenge was dismissed. Breckenridge, gathering his papers with the contained displeasure of a man who had lost without any obvious error but simply to a superior preparation, said nothing. Fannie accepted the ruling with a nod, thanked the examiner, and walked out of the hearing room into the July heat of San Antonio. Jonas was waiting outside. She looked at him, and some of the contained composure that had carried her through the hearing loosened slightly, not into tears or weakness, but into the relief of a person who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and can now briefly relax the grip. "Well," he said. "Dismissed," she said. "Both challenges failed. The claim stands." He stepped forward and took both her hands in his, right there on the boardwalk in front of the hotel, in front of the San Antonio pedestrians who came and went with their various purposes, and he held on with the warmth and solidity of someone who was done with being careful about the distance between them. "Fannie," he said, and just the way he said her name was a declaration. She looked up at him. "You rode a long way," she said, echoing his own words from May with an accuracy that made him feel understood in a way he had not expected. "I rode," he agreed, "a long way." And then, because they were both plain people who had gotten past the point of circumlocution, she squeezed his hands and said, "There is a decent restaurant 2 streets over. Buy me dinner, Jonas." He laughed, which was a sound she had not heard from him before, open and warm and genuine, and she discovered that she liked it enormously. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They had dinner that was far too long for a restaurant meal, and walked back along the river in the cooling evening air, and the conversation went to places that neither of them had entirely planned, which was the best kind of conversation. He told her about the dark years after Kansas, after his family's farm had failed, and his father had drunk himself into an early grave, and his younger sister had gone east with an aunt, leaving him at 19 with nothing but anger and capability in roughly equal measure, and no useful direction for either. He told her about the justice of the peace in Dodge City, a man named Elias Crum, who had seen something in him worth investing in and had taught him law and given him a direction, and how that single act of faith had built everything he was now. He told her about the loneliness of 7 years of deputy work, which was not a complaint but simply a fact, the kind of work that required you to keep moving and to keep your personal life light enough to move with you, and how he had come to question that arrangement with increasing frequency over the past year. Fannie told him about the particular loneliness of being exceptionally capable in a field where your expertise was routinely doubted by half the population before you opened your mouth. She told him about the specific frustration of knowing that she was better at her work than most of the men she encountered, and of having to demonstrate that every single time from scratch, never granted the professional assumption of competence that was simply extended to men. She told him about the choices she had made deliberately to keep herself unencumbered because the world of 1882 Texas did not make it easy to be both extremely good at a serious profession and to have a personal life that did not require you to diminish one for the sake of the other. "But you are not looking for someone who would ask you to diminish anything," Jonas said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "I am not." He stopped walking and turned to look at her in the evening light along the river. He had a decision to make, and unlike most of the decisions he made in his professional life, which were operational and tactical and could be assessed against established criteria, this one required a different kind of clarity. It required him to know what he was willing to offer without conditions. "I would not ask you to," he said, "diminish anything. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him for a long time. She was a precise person, Fannie Baker. She did not rush her measurements. She checked her figures. She made sure the line was right before she committed it to paper. "I believe you," she said, and the simplicity of it told him that it was not a small thing. He walked her to the hotel door that evening, and they stood in the lamplight for a moment, and he held her hand again and she let him, and they were both very aware of each other in the way that people are when the thing they have been being careful about has finally been explicitly acknowledged. "I have to go back to Pecos," he said, "but I am going to come to Crockett County before September." "I will be there," she said. "I always am." He smiled, and it was the quiet, warm smile that she had first seen in the land office when he had looked at her plat map, the one that was entirely genuine and had nothing performed about it. "I know," he said. The summer passed. Jonas resolved 3 other matters from his office in Pecos and spent more time thinking about Fannie Baker than was strictly productive, and their correspondence continued with the kind of regularity and depth that marked letters as something more than information exchange. He told her things he had not told anyone in years. She told him things she had not expected to tell, because she was discovering that the habit of reserve, which had served her so well professionally, was not something she wanted to maintain permanently in all directions. She completed the holding pond in August. The diversion channel was functioning, drawing from the spring with the controlled flow she had calculated, filling the pond to capacity in 4 days. She walked around the perimeter of the pond in the August evening light and felt a specific, deep satisfaction that was the satisfaction of a thing correctly done, a calculation made and verified by reality. The water was there. The land was hers. The work was real. Pete Ochoa, who had been with her for 5 months by then and had seen something in her from the beginning that deserved respect, said, "You did it, Miss Baker." "We did it," she said, because that was true and because she understood the value of what his knowledge of the country had contributed. He nodded in the way of a man who has been acknowledged properly. "What comes next?" he asked. She looked out at the pond, at the limestone slopes rising behind it, at the meadow where the creek willows trailed their long fingers in the current. She thought about the quarter section, about the 160 acres that were hers under the law she had understood better than the men who had tried to contest her, about what could be built here in the years ahead. Then she thought about Jonas, which she was doing more and more in the middle of thinking about the land, as if the two had become associated in her mind in a way that felt less like confusion and more like a natural convergence of things that belonged together. "A house," she said. "What comes next is a house." Pete smiled, which was not something he did often but which, when he did it, was entirely warm. "A good house," he said. Jonas arrived in Crockett County on the 1st of September, which was a day of extraordinary clarity, the air washed clean by a brief late summer rain, the light falling on the limestone and the willows, and the full holding pond with the particular gold of a Texas September afternoon. He came down the creek road on his bay horse, and she saw him coming from 100 yards off and stood still for a moment, just seeing him, the way you see a thing you have been anticipating when it finally becomes real. He stepped down from the horse and walked toward her across the meadow grass, and she walked toward him, and they met in the middle ground with the spring behind her and the limestone slopes ahead and the enormous sky above it all. He kissed her, which was the first time, and it was the kind of kiss that was both entirely certain and the beginning of something rather than the conclusion. She kissed him back with the complete attention she brought to things she was sure about, which was full and unflinching and real. When they separated, she said, "The holding pond is full." "I see that," he said, his hands on her shoulders, looking past her at the pond and then back at her face. "The claim is valid and the challenges are dismissed," she said. "I know," he said. "I read your letter." "The land is mine," she said. "Yes," he said. "And I am building a house," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that open, settled expression, the one that meant he was not going to step around what he actually meant. "Fannie," he said, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "for several months now about what I want. Not in the way I usually think about things operationally, with a plan and a sequence. Just what I want underneath all of that." He stopped for a moment. "I want to stop moving. I want to be in one place with one person, and I want that place to be this land, and I want that person to be you." She felt the full force of that land on her, the 160 acres that she had surveyed and filed and defended and built. She felt it the way you feel something that is genuinely yours, not as a burden but as a ground beneath your feet. And she felt the full force of Jonas Wallace, this man who had come to reclaim a disputed thing and had instead found himself in a place he had not expected. "That is an unusual thing," she said carefully, "to say to a woman who just spent 6 months proving she does not need anyone." "I know," he said. "But you said you were not looking for someone who would ask you to diminish anything. I am not. I am saying that I would like to build something with you if you will let me, not instead of what you are building, alongside it." Fannie Baker was precise. She was careful. She checked her figures and she ran her chain and she verified every measurement before she committed it to paper. She looked at Jonas Wallace, this man who had been honest with her from the very first moment in the land office, who had read her work and said it was extraordinary without being surprised that she was the one who had done it, who had ridden back in May not because she needed rescuing but because he had not been able to stay away, who had sat in the back of a hearing room and watched her be herself in full and come away more in love rather than less. She had checked her figures. "Alongside," she said. "Yes. That is the word." He pulled her close with the careful strength of a man who is aware of his own size relative to someone else's, and she held on to him with both hands, which was something she did not do with things she was uncertain about. Cal Harlan made one more attempt. In October, he appeared in person at the land office in Red Rock with Breckenridge at his side, and a new argument about the Mexican land grant that his attorney claimed had surfaced in the archives of the old Republic of Texas land records. He was banking on the idea that historical complexity would overwhelm a legal process that had already become expensive and exhausting. Jonas was in Red Rock when Harlan arrived, because he had arranged his assignments with a deliberate attention to proximity that Marshal Haverford continued to observe with quiet amusement and no comment. He was there not as Fannie's defender, but as a federal officer whose presence made clear that any attempt to interfere with a valid federal claim would have immediate official consequences. Fannie met Harlan at the land office with a folder of documents that included the legal history of the Mexican land grant system in Texas, the specific case, law regarding grant validity post-annexation, and the relevant federal statute clarifying that valid Desert Land Act filings superseded unregistered historical usage claims under Mexican grants that had never been adjudicated through the proper Texas courts. She had spent 3 weeks preparing this documentation after she had learned, through a contact in Austin, that the grant argument was coming. She was ready, as she had been ready every time, because readiness was the thing she could control, and she controlled everything she could. Harlan stood across the desk from her and Breckenridge presented the grant argument, and Fannie responded to it with a precision and a documented completeness that left the lawyer, a man who had won many land cases, with no technical ground to stand on. She was courteous. She was completely thorough. She offered to provide copies of all her documentation for the land office record. Harlan was a man who had been running cattle in Crockett County for 20 years and had never lost a land dispute. He looked at Fannie Baker with an expression that moved through several stages: contempt, then frustration, then something that was reluctant but genuine, which was recognition. "You came here knowing all of this," he said, not accusingly, just understanding it. "I spent 4 months in Austin reading land records before I came to Crockett County," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You intend to keep the land." "It is my land," she said. "Under federal law, yes." Another long pause. "I have had cattle grazing that meadow for 15 years. "I know," she said. "The survey showed the evidence of it. I have no quarrel with you, Mr. Harlan. I simply have a legal right that supersedes your historical usage, and I am going to exercise it." Cal Harlan was 64 years old, and he had seen the West change more times than he had expected when he was 40. He had seen the open range become the fenced range. He had seen Mexican families lose ground through legal complexity and American families gain it the same way. He had watched the railroad transform country he had thought he understood. He was not, underneath the pride and the political connections, A stupid man. He looked at Breckenridge. He looked at Fannie. He looked at Jonas Wallace, who was standing near the door with the quiet, present authority of a federal officer who was there and paying attention. He put on his hat. "I won't bring this back again," he said. "I appreciate that," Fannie said. He walked out. Breckenridge followed. Hargrove, the land office clerk, let out the same slow breath he had let out in April, and then he looked at Fannie Baker and Jonas Wallace and he smiled, because after 11 years in the Crockett County land office, he had an eye for the moment when a dispute was genuinely over. "I believe that is that," he said. "Yes," Fannie said. "I believe it is." She and Jonas walked out into the October Redrock Street, and the air was cool, and the sky was the deep clear blue of the Texas fall, and the whole complicated, exhausting, hard-won business of the past 7 months settled around her like something lifted, not a burden but a completed work. Jonas looked down at her with the open expression he wore now habitually when they were not in a professional context. He had put in his formal resignation to the Deputy Marshal's service 2 weeks earlier. He had told Marshal Haverford that he was intending to file a homestead claim on adjacent land to Baker's quarter section, and that he had a plan for what he intended to build there, which Haverford had accepted with a handshake, and a look that told Jonas his supervisor had been expecting this particular development for considerably longer than Jonas had. "It's over," Jonas said. "The legal part is over," she said. "The building part is just beginning." He took her hand on the Redrock boardwalk in the October light, entirely openly, the way a man holds a woman's hand when he is not concerned about who sees it. "Tell me about the building part," he said. She smiled, and it was the smile she showed to people she was entirely comfortable with, which was not many people, not many at all, but this man who had ridden in with a governor's letter and gone away shaken by a plat map, and ridden back in May for reasons that were only professionally justified at the very thinnest stretch of that description. This man had earned it. "The house foundation," she said. "I have the placement calculated already. On the low rise above the holding pond, oriented with the long wall facing south for light, with room for a porch on the creek side. Limestone block," he said. He had been learning in the months since he had decided to stay the specific texture of what building in this country required. "Local limestone," she said. "Pete knows a mason in Fort Stockton who works it well. It will be cool in the summer and solid in the winter, built to last." He squeezed her hand. "That sounds right," he said. "The house took 6 months to build, through the winter of 1882 and into the spring of 1883. Jonas filed his own homestead claim on the adjacent 40 acres to the north, which included a portion of the limestone slope and a stand of cottonwood along the creek, and began the practical work of establishing himself in the country he had chosen. He was useful in the way of a man who has done hard physical work most of his life, and he worked alongside the mason from Fort Stockton and Pete Ochoa and Rodrigo with the straightforward, competent effort that was one of the things Fannie had most appreciated in him from the beginning. He did not need to be in charge of things that were not his to be in charge of. He knew his own competence and he knew hers, and he was easy, entirely easy, with the fact that on this land, on the quarter section that bore her name in the Federal Registry, she was the one who had made the plan and understood it most completely. He also, in November of 1882, proposed to her. He did it without ceremony and without theater, sitting by the campfire on a November evening while the wind came down from the north, and the stars were enormously close and clear overhead. He said that he had been thinking about the word alongside, which she had said in September, and that he wanted to formalize what he understood alongside to mean, which was that they were building the same life in the same direction, and that he wanted that to be a legal and permanent fact as well as a personal one. She said yes. She said it immediately and without circumlocution, which was the most Fannie Baker way she could have said it, and he laughed and pulled her close and held her with the solid warmth of a man who had found, after a very long time of moving, the place he was going to stop. They were married in February of 1883 in the Redrock Church. A small ceremony with Pete Ochoa and Rodrigo present, and Hargrove the clerk and the minister, and a handful of Redrock townspeople who had been following the saga of Fannie Baker, and the Crockett County land claim with the deep interest that frontier communities invest in events that have the texture of legend. Jonas wore his best coat and had his hair cut and his boots polished. Fannie wore a dress of pale blue wool that she had ordered from a dressmaker in San Antonio, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that were the last of the autumn ones she had pressed in August in the meadow of the quarter section, the land that was hers and was now theirs alongside. The minister read the ceremony, and they spoke their vows with the direct simplicity of people who meant every word they said. And when it was done, they walked out into the February light as Fannie and Jonas Wallace and the assembled gathering of Redrock threw rice at them with considerable enthusiasm. Pete Ochoa shook Jonas's hand with the gravity of a man delivering a formal judgment. "You will be good to her," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I intend to be," Jonas said, and he was a man who meant what he said, which Pete already knew, which was why he had said it with satisfaction rather than warning. The spring of 1883 was wet, as the spring of 1882 had been, and the quarter section was green and the holding pond was full, and the house on the low rise above the meadow was finished in March, the limestone walls thick and cool, the south-facing windows catching the morning light the way Fannie had calculated they would, the porch on the creek side looking out over the willows, and the water with the particular quality of peace that comes from having fought for a thing honestly and won it completely. They moved into the house together in late March, carrying their things from the camp with the practicality of two people who were used to moving and were deeply glad to be stopping. Jonas hung his deputy's star on a nail in the storage room, not with bitterness, but with the clean finality of a chapter correctly concluded. He had applied for and received the position of county surveyor's assistant, which had felt like a joke at first when he mentioned it to Fannie, and then felt entirely right, because he was good at the methodical, patient work of measuring and documenting, and he had learned a great deal about the principles of it from months of reading over her shoulder, and asking the honest questions of a man who wanted to understand what his wife did. Fannie continued her professional survey work, taking commissions from the county and from private landowners who needed competent survey services, which in 1883 Crockett County was essentially everyone. Her reputation, which had been built on the impossible precision of the desert land filing and the double defeat of Breckenridge's legal challenges, was the kind of reputation that did not require advertising. People came to her. She was happy in the work in a way that was different from before, though the work itself was the same. Having Jonas, there did not diminish any part of it. She had been right that he was not that kind of man. He was interested in what she did, genuinely, not performatively, and his own growing knowledge of survey work made him a useful assistant on large projects in a way that Pete Ochoa, for all his invaluable knowledge of the country, could not be. They would go out on a large survey together, the two of them, working the chain and the transit level, and there was a specific happiness in that shared work that she had not anticipated, but had found to be one of the most quietly profound things in her life. They had their first child in January of 1884, a boy they named Edmund, after her father, a name that Jonas had suggested without her prompting, which had moved her to the kind of emotion she usually kept well contained. Edmund Wallace was born in the limestone house with a midwife from Fort Stockton in attendance, a robust and loud announcement of his arrival into the world, and Jonas held him with the careful, wondering attention of a man for whom this was entirely new, and who was approaching it with the same honest, effortful intention he brought to everything. Fannie looked at Jonas holding Edmund in the lamplight of the bedroom in the limestone house and felt the full, complicated weight of everything that had come to rest here, All the choices and the work and the legal battles and the letters and the long conversations by the fire. She felt it as a completeness, a survey correctly finished, every line in its proper place, the whole form of it coherent and true. "He has your ears," she said. Jonas looked at his son's ears with the frowning attention of a man evaluating this information. "I hope that is not a hardship for him," he said. She laughed, which made Edmund startle and then settle, and Jonas looked up at her with that open, warm expression, the one that was only ever for her, and she felt the love in it like the warm weight of the Texas sun. Pete Ochoa, who came by the house on a cold January afternoon to inquire about the arrival, held Edmund with the careful expertise of a man who had raised children of his own, and was not surprised by the loudness or the smallness of them. He looked at the baby and then at Fannie and Jonas, sitting close together at the table in the way of people who have settled into the habit of proximity and find it indispensable. "Good," Pete said. "This is good." He was right. It was. In the years that followed, the quarter section became a working proposition in the fullest sense. The spring and the holding pond supported a small but productive garden, and an orchard of 10 trees that Fannie had planted in the fall of 1883, peach and apple and pear, which in the years of adequate rain produced fruit in quantities that filled the root cellar and provided trade goods with the Raydrock General Store. Jonas raised a small herd of cattle on the adjacent 40 acres and the leased grazing land that he had arranged through the county, managing them with the patient, methodical care that was his particular manner with all things. They were not wealthy people in the way of the cattle barons, but they were prosperous in the way of people who own what they own cleanly, without debt or obligation to anyone. Crockett County grew around them through the 1880s. The railroad reached closer. New settlers came. The legal landscape of land claims and homestead filings became more complex and more contested as the frontier compressed, and Fannie's reputation as a surveyor of exceptional competence and complete legal knowledge drew commissions from as far as El Paso and Midland. She testified as an expert witness in 2 federal land cases, both times with the calm authority of someone who has simply done the work more thoroughly than anyone else in the room. The second child came in 1886, a girl they named Clara, who arrived with less drama than her brother and gazed at the world from her first day with the steady, assessing eyes of someone doing a measurement. Jonas declared that she had her mother's eyes in more ways than one, and Fannie did not contradict him because it was true. Edmund, at 2, accepted his sister with the benevolent indifference of a child whose world has just expanded in an unexpected direction. He spent the morning of her arrival regarding her in the cradle with a serious expression, and then went out to help Pete Ochoa with a fence repair, which was his preferred occupation from the age of 18 months. He was going to be a practical person, like both of his parents, though which of their specific practical inclinations he would choose was still a matter of active investigation. Cal Harlan died in the summer of 1885, and his sons, who were more practical men than their father had been by the end, had already shifted the family's grazing operations to land they held without dispute. The youngest Harlan son, a man named Theo who was about Jonas's age, came to the Wallace homestead one afternoon in the fall of 1885 to buy survey work, needing an accurate plat of his family's undisputed holdings for a land sale he was arranging. He handed the commission to Fannie without any evident awkwardness, which she found to be, in its own way, a form of conclusion. She did the survey. It was accurate as all her surveys were. In 1887, Fannie was approached by a county commissioner about establishing a formal survey school, a short course that could train younger men entering the profession on the mathematical and legal fundamentals that many of them lacked. She spent a month thinking about it, discussing it with Jonas in the evenings on the creekside porch with Edmund and Clara running in the meadow grass below them. The school would take her time away from private commissions, but the need in the county was real. There were too many surveys done badly, too many legal claims built on inadequate technical foundations that eventually collapsed into disputes and hardship. Jonas watched her think about it with the patient attention he gave to the things she was working through and said, "The county needs it. You are the only person who could do it properly. You will do it." "You have not asked me whether I want to," she said, which was not a complaint but a curiosity. "I can see whether you want to," he said. "You want to, you are just deciding whether you should want to." She looked at him. He was right, which was something he was with infrequency that she had come to find one of the most reliable facts of her life. "You know me very well," she said. "I have been paying close attention," he said, "for 5 years." She started the school in the spring of 1888. It met twice a week in the Redrock land office. 6 students in the first session, 12 in the second, young men from the county who needed to understand the mathematics and law of land measurement well enough to do the work honestly. She taught them the way her father had taught her, with rigor and patience, and the foundational conviction that a line in the wrong place was a form of lie. She gave them each a copy of the General Land Office instructions and required them to read it fully before the second session. 3 of the first session's students went on to work as county surveyors in their own right over the following decade. One of them wrote her a letter in 1896, well after the school had closed and she had moved on to other things, telling her that the instruction she had given him was the most useful professional preparation he had ever received. She kept that letter in the same inside coat pocket where she had once kept Jonas's first personal letter, which she also still had, folded and somewhat worn at the edges but entirely legible. In the summer of 1889, on a June evening that was warm but not punishing, with the creek willows throwing long shadows across the meadow and the holding pond reflecting the last light of the day, Fannie stood on the porch of the limestone house and watched Edmund, now 5, chasing Clara, now 3, through the meadow grass with the wholehearted abandon of children who are completely secure in their world. Jonas came out from the house behind her and stood at her back, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, his hands settling on her shoulders with the familiar ease of a man who is entirely comfortable in the place he has chosen. "Edmund is going to be tall," he said. "He takes after you," she said, "and he has your persistence." "That's the thing you like least about me," Jonas said, with the lightness of a man who is entirely secure in his wife's affection and can therefore joke about it. "It is the thing I find most useful in you," she said, turning slightly to look at him, "and the thing that occasionally makes you impossible, both at the same time." He laughed and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him with the full, easy weight of someone who has found the exact place they belong. They stood like that and watched their children in the meadow of the land she had surveyed and filed and defended, the 160 acres that the law had recognized and the Harlans had contested and the federal examiner had affirmed, the land that had started all of this, the disputed quarter section that had turned out not to be disputed at all once Fannie Baker had put her precise, thorough, legally impeccable documentation in front of the right people. The spring was still running. She could hear it from the porch, the quiet, persistent sound of water finding its way through the limestone, filling the pond, feeding the willows, doing what it had always done regardless of who claimed the land above it. It would outlast all of them, that spring, would still be running when Edmund's children ran through this meadow and Clara's children drew their own maps of a world still being made. But right now it was 1889, and the evening was warm and Jonas Wallace had his arms around her, and their children were laughing in the meadow grass, and the limestone house was solid at her back and everything, every last calculated, hard-won, precisely measured thing, was exactly where it was supposed to be. Fannie Baker had always known that a properly drawn line was one of the most powerful things a person could put on paper. She had learned that from her father, who had been right about most things and never wrong about the ones that counted. What she had not known when she packed his theodolite and his chains and his books into a trunk in the winter of 1880 and bought a ticket west, was that the most important line she would ever draw was not on any map. It was the line she had held, firm and clear and legally documented, across the contested ground of who she was and what she deserved, and whether the world as she found it would let her be all of herself without apology. She had held that line. And Jonas Wallace, who had ridden in with a governor's letter and the expectation of reclaiming disputed ground, had found the line and recognized it, and instead of contesting it, had built his life on the right side of it. That was the survey she was proudest of. That was the one that mattered most. The spring ran on in the evening, and the stars began to appear above the limestone slopes, those enormous, indifferent Texas stars that did not care whether you were a surveyor or a deputy or a cattle baron or a child in the meadow grass, but shone down on all of it with the same vast, uncomplicated light. Edmund caught Clara and she shrieked with delight, and the sound of it carried up the low rise to the porch, and Jonas laughed quietly behind her, and Fannie felt the full, settled, complete weight of a life built on solid ground. Everything was accounted for. Every line was in its proper place. The claim was valid and the house was built and the family was here, alive and specific and entirely real, on the land she had surveyed and filed and refused to yield. She had always known that a properly drawn line was permanent. This one, she was certain, was going to last.